Welcome to the Insightful Investor Podcast, a weekly series that seeks to share industry, investment, and market insights. Learn more about our show at insightfulinvestor.org. I'm thrilled to welcome Bruno Dell'Ama, a pioneering entrepreneur in the asset management industry and co-founder of both Global X and Sangha. Bruno's journey is marked by bold decisions, from leaving his home country of Spain at the age of 20, immigrating to the US at 22, to launching a multi-billion-dollar asset management firm during the depths of the financial crisis, and now empowering others through peer support and shared wisdom. All the things we're going to talk about today. In this conversation, we'll delve into his story, the lessons he's learned, and his unique perspective on success, leadership, and the intersection of business and spirituality. Bruno, welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Pleasure to be here.
Let's start with Global X. What inspired you to found Global X, and what was your original vision for the company?
Yeah, the original idea actually came from a friend of mine, my partner, Jose. He owned at the time a broker-dealer company that was mostly focused on wealthy individuals in Latin America. And he had a lot of Colombian clients, and they were buying these structured notes. And they were buying millions of dollars of the structured note. And he was mystified because the note had a lot of issues. It was essentially backed by the only ADR, Colombian ADR that existed in the New York Stock Exchange at the time. So there was no diversification. It was pretty expensive. There was liquidity risk as a note. And so he was trying to understand, why are you guys buying these? And so these were very wealthy Colombians that were seeing the capital market situation in the country of Colombia really turn around with security, and the domestic companies doing really well. And so they wanted to bring a lot of their offshore capital into Colombian equity type exposure. And so he thought, well, what's a better product to do this? And he thought an exchange traded fund, an ETF that really represents the entire Colombian capital market. That's liquid, it's diversified, it's cost effective, it trades on the New York Stock Exchange. And so he called iShares, BGI, Barclays at the time. And he said, I have a lot of clients that could use this exposure. Would you guys bring to market a Colombia ETF? Of course, iShares was and is the ETF provider with the broadest slew of country ETFs. And iShares said, we will never do that. And so I remember having a conversation with Jose, and he said, well, maybe I should do that because I know there's demand. I know the largest provider in the market is not going to provide it. And so that idea stayed in my head, and I ended up developing a full business plan. And the initial plan was really to offer niche country ETFs across international capital markets that were just not available. And so these were some of the smaller capital markets, but still relatively large markets. And so the idea was to provide that slew of international exposure that was not available in the market.
Well, they say timing is everything. You launched Global X in 2008, right in the depths of the global financial crisis. And obviously there was extreme market turbulence. How did that impact the business in those early days?
Well, the main thing was we started the business in April of 2008. We decided to wait until we had the approval to launch ETFs, the regulatory relief from the Securities and Exchange Commission, as it's called, because at the time it was a real asset. And so that would deliver the risk for investors. And we received our relief a week before Lehman collapsed. And so as you'll kind of remember, we all remember that difficult period. All venture capital firms were really just focused on supporting their existing portfolio companies. And there was no real thought of expanding towards new investments. And so the decision in front of us was, well, either continue self-funding the business, which really meant the company is going to be massively undercapitalized because this was an expensive business proposition to build and we had limited resources, or shut it down. And so we decided to follow the former path. And so the main implication was we had to build a business with very limited resources, very scrappy. The other thing that was maybe a positive is that a lot of talent, a lot of great talent was available. And so we could, even though we had a tiny team, we could bring really high caliber people. And then similarly with service providers, as we were building the business, we could negotiate some preferential pricing. We had a highly outsourced model. And then as we brought the first products, the negative was that there was no real flows into these markets. The positive is that we pretty much started our first products at the bottom of the market. So performance was pretty good, but I don't know that that was necessarily a huge benefit for the business because all of the products that we deliver were passive index-based products that were just tracking a market or an index.
It's interesting when you look back, it seems more obvious than I'm sure it did when you were right in the middle of it. It seems more obvious that it was such a great time to start a business. But at that moment, there's a lot of uncertainty and the road ahead is very unclear.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, at a personal level, my partner and I are making the biggest bets of our lives because we couldn't raise capital. Not only, our personal portfolios and investment was massively declined, which is what was happening in the capital markets. But essentially, we had to put over time all of our capital into the business. So that's massively nerve wracking, and just sort of the volatility and the fear that was around at the time just makes everything kind of more difficult and more complex. And 2 years into the business, we had only, we spent the first year setting up the infrastructure, second year launching our first funds, and 2 years in, we were sitting in about 11 million in assets under management, tiny amount of revenues, and certainly not a fun period.
And so what was the pivotal moment for the business to take off?
I was studying the markets pretty closely. At the time, China just surpassed Japan as the second largest capital market in the world. And you were seeing enormous amounts of flows into China type exposures, and particularly in ETFs. There were 3 China ETFs, but they were essentially the same thing. They were like mega cap China ETFs. And if you look at the U.S. market, the largest ETFs above, the S&P 500, the Dow Jones, were the sector spiders, the sector exposures of the U.S. markets. And so we thought, why don't we develop sector type exposures for China? Because people are not necessarily only want to have, passive mega cap China exposure. Maybe there's people that want to have specific bets to the Chinese consumer or Chinese technology, etc. That was the intuition. It was a very clear sort of vision of, I had a lot of conviction that was going to work. It was a deviation from our business plan, but my partner was very supportive. He could see the idea pretty clearly as well. And we approached our partners and we said, we want to bring to market these 6 products, which was really an all-in moment. We needed those products to hit pretty quickly because we were supporting 2 products to support 8 products. Essentially, they had to, we had to raise a lot of capital really quickly or we would go out of business and blow essentially our life savings within 3 months. We approached our partners and they said, what do you mean you want to launch, 6 new products and you guys are not even, succeeding with the 2 products you have. So you need to launch an ETF. You need a market maker to provide the seed capital. And so they said, we'll support 2 products. And so we chose the 2 products we wanted. And that was in November of 2009. And the products just hit the market like crazy. And so we ended at the end of that month with from 11 million in assets to 100 million in assets. And then we raised 100 million in assets every month after that. And we started launching all sorts of products and different innovations that were not part of our business plan. And every product we brought to market was an overnight success. And so fast forward for the next 18 months, we went from those 11 million in assets to 1.3 billion in assets. And, through half of that journey, it was really me, my partner, an intern, a couple of, laptops and a printer. And it was a pretty magical time.
But obviously, beyond the few people involved, there were great innovations that allowed for that escape velocity to ensue. Would you talk to some of the other innovations in the ETF industry at the time that you worked on?
As a new provider, it was very clear that every product we brought to market had to be innovative, something new of value to investors. One of the innovations that we brought to market at that time, we started, we were thinking about access to capital markets in ways that were just different than what was happening at the time, particularly with innovation and technology. So when people at the time wanted to express a bet through ETFs in innovation, what they were buying was either the NASDAQ index or the technology ETF. And, we looked within the technology sector fund, and some of the companies there manufactured, some of them manufactured, disruptive chips and robotics and artificial intelligence, and some of them made computers. And making computers at the time was sort of like making a fridge, or it was really not a technology in the sense of, it was more of an industrial type application. And yet you had in the industrial sector ETF a company like Tesla, which was clearly a disruptive technology. And that was happening everywhere. That was happening in our sector in finance. That was happening. And so we were the first company that started to really look at those disruptions and say, we want a lot more pure play access to those themes. And so we brought to market a fintech ETF, a robotics ETF. We brought to market an artificial intelligence ETF maybe a decade ago, years before, large language models and kind of the ubiquitous exposure to AI. So interestingly, at the time, a lot of the financial commentators thought that was gimmicky, was kind of the operative word of the kinds of funds that we're bringing to market. But fast forward to today, thematic type exposures are an entire sector now in our asset management industry. So that was definitely a lot of innovation around product and product development. That innovation was not only the types of exposures, but also the entire package. So we saw that you could really add value to clients and be competitive if you brought real price disruption. And of course, Vanguard proved that, and it's been one of the largest asset management companies in terms of growth in the world for decades, and certainly in the ETF space for the last 15 years. But Vanguard was not doing everything. There were exposures that, we saw we could offer the same exposure at half the price in relatively, big segments. So these would be spaces where competing asset managers have 10 billion in assets or more. So for example, we brought to market at half the price a preferred ETF, an MLP ETF. Those are, billion plus ETFs today. So disruption from a pricing perspective. The other one that I would point to was more business model disruption. So at the time, I came into the ETF space from outside asset management, but most of my peers really came to leadership positions in ETFs from the mutual fund industry. And as a result, they were implementing a lot of mutual fund-like types of management, but the ETF market is pretty distinct from mutual funds. And people understood that, but still they were applying a lot of the same models, particularly to distribution. And one of the things that we recognized pretty early was the self-directed retail investor was a big component and a very large growing component of the ETF market. And so we developed a really new way of accessing that type of investor through marketing and sales machinery that was pretty innovative at the time. And part of it is we decided, we built it from a place of not knowing. We came into the space not knowing how things were done. And so we had to figure them out by trial and error as to what works. And we ended up developing, probably at the time, the most innovative marketing machine for the retail space in the ETF market.
I guess when you have a market segment that isn't easily accessible already, that comes with a compelling story, and you put it together, and then you have good performance, and that's partly the recipe for it to take off.
Yeah, I mean, like in every industry, in every sector, are you adding value? Are you bringing something to people that really adds value? And can you make them aware of it, and can they have access to it? And so that was our focus.
So you had an incredible journey at Global X. What do you think were the key lessons you learned while you were there?
Well, I learned a lot of lessons. I made a lot of mistakes. Maybe the most transformative thing for me personally was learning about true leadership the way I understand it today. So when I've always been considered a good boss, a good manager, created really effective yet progressive, great culture, great ambience, sort of work environments. But when I started, I sort of brought my best ideas of how to manage, and I sort of implemented that model to everyone. This is how I was managing people. And some people did really well within that structure of that framework. And some people didn't thrive as much. And I pretty quickly realized that, every human is different and we all kind of react to things in our own ways. And some people actually want some level of micromanagement. And some people really sort of require a constant pat in the back. And, there's just our personalities and our way of seeing the world and approaching the world just shows up. And so my initial instinct was, well, that's not my problem. That's your problem. You have to adjust to my model. But of course, I'm, the CEO of the company, majority shareholder. And so clearly it is my problem to make the team perform at a high level. And so my second approach to this was, okay, fine, I have to customize my leadership to, my entire management team. But what a pain in the neck, because it's a lot more work to do, to manage individuals in kind of more tailored ways than just one model, one size fits all. And I realized, of course, if 80% of my job was managing my team and leading my team, I'm self-defining 80% of my job to be a pain in the neck. And so I didn't want that. I wanted my job to be fun and expansive and enjoyable and effective, of course. And I made a very simple reframe that on the surface is very simple, but it's actually very fundamental and substantive, which was, I had a sense that every field in kind of the field of business science, if you want, sales, marketing, finance, etc., that the curve of learning, it's sort of like a declining curve. You learn a lot pretty quickly and then it sort of trails off. But I thought this field of leadership feels more like an exponential curve where you actually probably learn pretty slowly at the beginning, but that really starts to compound. And importantly, it's sort of unlimited. This is probably a field where I could, if I really wanted to be the best leader in the world, I probably will never stop learning. And, what an exciting proposition. I was probably late 30s at the time and just kind of like a new entire field of opportunity and growth was opening in front of my eyes. And so I really tackled that with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. And what that journey did for me is that, of course, as you're leading human beings, what you're really doing is you're bringing the best out of them. And that ultimately it's about humanity and what motivates us. And as you go deeper and deeper, some of the fundamental questions of, okay, why is my head of marketing here? And why is my head of sales here? And why is my CFO here? And why am I here? And what are we doing? What's the point of this whole thing? And so it was a beautiful journey and exploration that just opened, an entire dimension of my life of essentially going on a journey of, okay, how do I become, the fullest expression of being human that I can become?
It's so interesting the way you describe it, because in some ways it's like problem solving. So as you were running the company, you're problem solving of what ETFs can we launch? What will the demand look like? What's the competition like? And you're trying to solve that problem. When you move into the realm of humans and relations with humans, it's remarkable how complex that can be. And that's, I think, partly why it's a lifelong journey.
Human beings are the most complex machine, if you want to use that term, that exists. And there's a lot of different things happening that I have now, and it's still emerging, but much better understanding than I did back then. And if you want to be, literally the best leader in the world, you almost need to transform yourself really completely. And through that process have a much better understanding of the forces of what's happening and how is it happening, and how does that affect us. And yes, it's certainly a lifelong journey for me. It has been for the last decades, and it probably will be until I die.
Well, you sold Global X and you went through a transition period. What did that look like, and what did you learn during those years before ultimately starting Sangha?
Selling the company was not something I was, it was not in my field. I wasn't looking for that. My partner at some point wanted to sell his equity in the company. I found him a buyer, and the buyer said, but if you, for the price that my partner wanted, but the buyer said, if you sell the whole thing, I'll pay twice the multiple, which of course my partner was like, okay, Bruno, join the party here. Help a brother. And it was a difficult decision for me. I didn't really have, I generally have a lot of clarity with decisions in life, not to mean that I don't make mistakes. Of course, I make a lot of mistakes, but I just kind of have clarity and make the decision and move forward. That was a difficult decision for me. It felt binary in the sense that I almost put myself in a place of one decision, selling or not selling, is the right one. And of course, if you do sell, you can't undo the decision, right? So there was a significant severity to the decision. And, of course, the reality is both decisions are great. These are really great outcomes. And I just really retrospectively, if I'm truly honest with myself, I didn't really decide to sell. It was sort of like the decision made itself. It was sort of the path of least resistance of the best outcome for my partner, for my employees, for the company, for the buyer, for sort of the entire ecosystem. It was going to unlock and generate a lot of wealth for a lot of people. And so I did that. And, in the process of that, I tried to do a crash course on life after a sale, and there was very little literature about that at the time. There's a lot more literature now, but the statistics are kind of shocking. So, something like 1 out of 5 people that sell a business, 20%, retrospectively consider that the worst decision of their lives. And about 2/3 of people are pretty lost for 2 years. And, it's hard to feel sorry for people that sell a business and are sitting on a lot of money. And of course, you have a lot of clients that go through that transition in life. So you have a sense of that as well. But, you lose a lot of your social network, how you're perceived in life, not just yourself, but your spouses and your entire family. And there's a big question of like, what's okay? Like, if that's not the thing now, and, that kept me working 70 hours a week every week, what's the thing now? And what's my orientation, and what do I do with my life? And I was pretty fortunate that with that journey that started with trying to be the best leader that I could be, I essentially found myself in a journey of growth and transformation. We may call it a spiritual journey. I don't think about it that way because it sort of splits with, to me, it's just becoming a full human. And so I didn't really have the issues of being lost. I just immediately threw myself into this journey of growth and transformation, doing a lot of readings of, wisdom across different traditions and people that I thought had access to and a better understanding of those questions that I was asking myself than I did. Of course, I did, some of the normal kind of housekeeping of building the family office and taking care of the portfolio. And of course, Evoke and your team helps with some of that, particularly for access to alternative exposures and diligence to alternative exposures. That's, it's harder for me to do directly. I also did a number of private investments. I was probably a little bit naive. My private investments in the areas that I understood pretty well, in finance and fintech, generally as a portfolio have done really, really well. As soon as I moved to other asset classes for problems that I thought were, worth solving, but I didn't really have a good understanding, particularly around healthcare, did not do well. And also private investments just take more time than I thought it would. And so right now I am chairman of 2 companies. One is a software SaaS company here in the Bay Area That's doing really well, helping with vendors, vendor onboarding, and working with another company, a fintech company in Spain on the mortgage space. That's really creating a lot of disruption and bringing a lot of digital technologies and AI to the mortgage market in Spain. And so that's fun. That I love business. I love the problem solving. I love to add values to the entrepreneurs and solve some of those problems that they're dealing with. But really, most of my focus was self-growth, self-transformation, and that's an ongoing journey that I continue today.
From my perspective, I believe that focus that you started while you were at Global X is what allowed you to be in the minority of those who sell their business and thrive post sale, because that was a passion of yours while you were at Global X. And then after selling, all of a sudden you have more time to focus on it. And you already had that going and you had the momentum already start and you just continued it after the sale.
I mean, I feel very fortunate that way. One of the things that I also observe, going back to some of the lessons learned, this was probably just as powerful a lesson as the kind of the leadership lesson was when, I told the story how we went from 11 million to 1.3 billion. The business plan that we had laid out for ourselves was to get to 2 billion in assets. And, how happy would I be if we ever got there? And we did. And I was, thrilled and it was really exciting. And eventually, not very long after that, I found myself thinking, well, if we got to 3 billion, like that would be nice. And we got to 3 billion pretty quickly after that. And I enjoyed that for 5 minutes. And then my mind was reeling again, well, if we got to 5 billion. And I caught myself as I was doing that. And, this is a pretty fundamental thing that most humans miss. And the value of catching ourselves doing this is transformational. What is this thing anyway? What was I doing? Why was I doing it? What's the purpose of it? What's the, and there's a term that speaks to these called the hedonic treadmill. And 90% of humanity, maybe more, lives in this hedonic treadmill of more and more. And, if you think about kind of, you were asking about the complexity of being human, this is a critical point that we need to get to as human beings to really start the process of deep transformation. Otherwise, we just keep ourselves in a loop of essentially guaranteed unhappiness. I don't know that I may be wrong about these, but I haven't found one single human being that has proven this.
Well, if you keep moving the finish line, you never get there, right?
I mean, by definition, right? And so if you think about that model, there's two fundamental problems. One, the model of we're setting up our objectives and working really hard to get there with the understanding that when we get there, we'll be happy, which is not true. Like experientially, that is not true. The problem with that to begin with is that, well, a lot of people will not even get to that initial finish line. So there's that. And then those that get to the finish line, then to your point, the finish line, well, then you never get there because in that treadmill, you just keep on pushing it forward and forward. And so I was really struck by kind of the ultimate example. Like if you take all of us 7 billion human beings and you go to what humanity would consider the front of the line, you meet Elon Musk and he's like literally, in front of the 7 billion humans in terms of how we think about success. And there was this podcast that he did with a German journalist, and the journalist asked him about death. And he said, what do you think about death? And Elon said, I think it will come as a relief. And even if that was a throwaway comment, which it could be, it just to me shows a state of mind of somebody in the midst of ultimate success. For him, it's even worse because, if he had one human being with less wealth than him, he could say, well, once I become number one, then I'll be happy, right? And then he gets there and he's like, wow, I'm not happy, So that catching myself in that process of moving the finish line and realizing the futility and the mental mistake and the implications of that and the ability through, this is not an easy thing to do, but it's doable, of reprogramming that. But obviously the first step of reprogramming that is just realizing that you're doing it. Because most of us, I was doing it unconsciously, like it was just a thing. And I just was very fortunate to catch myself in that process. And so that to me is probably most of the most fundamental changes that humans need to go through, which is understanding, hey, like what is the game? If that's not the game, what is the game?
Would you share what Sangha is, why you launched it, and how it operates?
I was at the time a member of YPO, Young Presidents Organization, which is an organization of 40,000 CEOs around the world, and the largest CEO organization globally. I was a member of the chapter in New York, which is the oldest original chapter and the largest chapter. And as I was going through this journey, a lot of my training and my ethos was very much in the business world. And so I thought, if I want to change my orientation and I want to learn about these new things, I probably need to create, new centers of gravity, new things that kind of attract me to those new types of learnings and activities, and maybe cut loose some of the things that keep me anchored to my old self that, are just maybe not as meaningful right now. And so I decided to leave YPO. And just as I made that decision, somebody in my chapter in New York started a mindfulness WhatsApp group. And a whole bunch of people from my chapter joined. And that was super interesting because I was like, wow, okay, hold on. There's, I guess, more people that have these orientation under the hood that I thought of. They're either doing it or they're interested in learning more, which is true. So, I do know today, because I'm completely out of the closet with regards to my spiritual orientation. Most people are not. Most people in the business world are very private about anything they may do that may sound a little woo or a little spiritual, because it's just not viewed as something helpful in your career. And so people are very private about that. And I got in touch with the person that started that group. This dear friend of mine now, I didn't know him at the time, Jonathan Krieger. And on that call, I said to John, why don't we start the main thing inside of YPO that keeps most people join YPO for the network, and they stay in YPO for this thing called Forum. So Forum is basically you meet with, 7, 8, 9 CEOs on a monthly basis. And it's sort of each other board of trustees, board of directors in their lives, because as a CEO, in many regards, you feel pretty lonely in a number of areas where there's a lot of things that you can't really talk to your employees about, or your peers or your spouse. And so you have a network of people that are sort of in, similar circumstances as you are, where you can discuss a lot of things. And so I said to John, why don't we start our own group of 7, 8 people, but let's do it so that everybody in the group has this, broader spiritual orientation in their lives. And let's give us room to change the format of how these things are run, because there's a very particular format to really suit our needs, and sort of let it evolve over time. And so we've been doing this for the last 4 years, and it's been transformational for, right now we were initially 8 people, we're down to 6, 4 men and 2 women. And it's radically transformed our lives. It's been such a powerful gift for every single one of us. And the extent of the transformation of every one of us in that group has been incredible from every dimension, personal, professional, spiritual. And I received a calling to make that available to others and bring that to the world. And so Sangha, what Sangha is, it's essentially your own wisdom circle, if you want. So this is a group of 7 or 8 very highly developed humans that are really committed to their own self-actualization, growth in consciousness, whatever your term may be for that. And so they commit to their own growth and transformation, and they commit to really supporting those in the group in their own journeys. And so and we bring a lot of social technology and really powerful structures as to how to train those groups so that they're really self-sufficient to do this on their own. And so there's no doctrine here. There's no teachings. There's no dogma. There's none of that. This is really, incredibly powerful individuals that have to be selected into Sangha, that they clearly see this as something in service to themselves and their journey, that they commit to helping others around them. And it's just a tool in their lives as they kind of try to make sense of what's going on and try to navigate the world in as much wisdom as possible.
And how do you incorporate spirituality into your approach to business and life? And how is that reflected in Sangha?
I don't think about it as something. Just the way you phrase the question, Alex, implies that there's sort of like a separation. This is the spiritual life, this is the professional life, this is the whatever, right? And the way I live my life is I just live life fully as I can in its fullest expression. And that includes the fact that I do projects. You can think about them as business projects. That includes the fact that there's loved ones, including a spouse and family and friends. And it includes the fact that I work on myself in becoming better at life, which includes all of the above. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I just want to point out, I don't think about it as incorporate spirituality. I live life fully. And of course, to do that, there are certain tools and certain practices that just makes one, you be more present in life, be more effective, be more connected, what have you. So I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it's very helpful. We talked about the finish line that keeps moving. If that's not how you define success, how do you think about it?
My perspective, which could be wrong, but my perspective is that the reason we're here and really our highest ethical calling, what we actually have to do is to grow as humans, to transform our consciousness, to become fully human. We come here to become what we can be. And, if you think about the great spiritual teachers across traditions, Buddha saying, your true nature is this Buddha nature, and your calling is to become that Buddha nature. Or, Jesus, the first word that he said in the Gospels is this word called metanoia, which was mistranslated. But what metanoia actually means in Greece is change your mind, change your consciousness. And so that calling, which is true across every wisdom tradition, and it's true across the great philosophers, and it's true across the great humans that we've had, that's what we're called to do. And then what happens when one goes in that journey, this may sound crazy, but this is my experience. You essentially become supported by all of nature. Like all of nature, once we behave according to our nature, all of nature guides us and supports us and collaborates with that journey and that process.
As opposed to feeling friction.
That's exactly right. So most of us operate from a place of wanting and grasping and working towards the thing. And as we talked about, through the hedonic treadmill, resetting and moving the goalpost and just continuing on that. And the game really is, what am I asked to do here? What's the point of this? And the easiest way for people that are not really working through these, but they maybe have an interest or an opening, is just to connect with their hearts and kind of ask themselves in their hearts deeply, in a place of silence, not in a place of I'm running meetings and more meetings and call and hyperactivity, but kind of take some space, create a little bit of spaciousness, and just ask themselves, like, what am I being called to do? What's the right next step? What I found in my own journey to be probably the single most effective access point to do that anybody can do is just journal. Even if it's 5 minutes a day with a simple question, like, what's being asked of me today? Not what society is asking of me, my parents, my bosses, my spouse, my job, like fundamentally, substantially, what's being asked of me. And you just journal on that question or a question along those lines, whatever comes for you, for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And that will show you the path. That's been my experience.
The way that you're describing it, it almost sounds like once you figure that out, then there's a certain level of peace that comes with it. And kind of you're working your way through the world, and it seems like everything's flowing in the same direction as opposed to constant conflict.
Yes, because really most of us are at war with the world. When you start moving away from war or something else, it feels like peace. A better state, which comes after peace, is honestly fire. Inner fire. Oh, wonder, excitement, and just incredible boundless energy to do any, because as you go through that process and you're supported by everything around you, you have crazy encounters and conversations and synchronicities and things that happen that just show up in your path as you're essentially moving from that friction of this is the direction that I think I need to go towards like, hold on, this is where life wants me to go. And as you go from upstream to downstream with the river of life, where everything becomes easier. And so all of that grasping and running and difficulty brings you to peace and eventually to fire, to real, because as you open your eyes really and you allow yourself to see what's happening, it's a pretty wondrous reality that we're living in, and it's pretty magical. And of course, one has to be careful to say, well, my life, I live in magic, because of course there's an enormous amount of suffering around us. But we kind of have to say that, because if we don't allow people to understand that that possibility is not only out there, but that is your highest ethical calling, to live in wonder and awe and magic, unless you know that that's not only possible, but that's, what you can do pretty quickly if you reorient your life. We need that motivation. Peace doesn't sound very motivating. Peace in the context of war sounds motivating, but the fact of the matter is that when we're in that war, we become addicted to things that keep us blind. Buddha said something along the lines of, humanity, society is like fish flopping around in small paddles, competing with one another. That's a pretty apt description, I think, of, our society. And so we become blinded by that. I have another friend that he had a real deep inquiry of, why are we not surrounded by enlightened beings? Why are there not more people out there? And it's a really profound inquiry if you really think about it. And there's a number of things that cause that to happen, but the main one that he came to, which I agree, he calls it tribal resonance. So, we are programmed as we come into the world to be in resonance with our mother, because we need that to be fed and survival and happiness. And then we resonate with our families, and then our classmates, and then, our jobs and our country. And we're basically social beings that want to be accepted and loved. Essentially, we're all looking for love. That's the operating kind of principle of the world. But in that sort of seal to fit in and resonate, and it just keeps us bound. It keeps us bound by the norms of our society and our jobs and how we run corporations and what it means to be a leader, and what's acceptable for somebody to say in a podcast. And we kind of need to have a lot of courage, and that's why Sangha and these wisdom circles are so powerful, because all of a sudden I find a small group of people in search of truth that we can allow our little group of 6, 7, 8 people to resonate with each other. That may be totally different than society, but it keeps us sane. It keeps us connected with humans, and it gives us permission to go there.
And circling back to our earlier conversation about leadership, what you described when you said fire, it's about having drive, having curiosity, a pursuit of growth. And as a leader, if you can identify that in the people that work with you and for you, and you help them realize that and achieve those long-term objectives, that's how you can probably get the most out of people.
Yeah, that's spot on. So how do you move mountains, right? If you're creating a project, building an asset management company, building Sangha, building whatever, like you're building something, Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to bring, if you need other humans to support you, if you can't do it alone, if you want to do it with others, to bring just a lot more power and a lot more capacity, well, you have to tell them a story. Like, what are we doing? And, fundamentally, why are we doing this? Right? Like, what's the purpose behind this? And the corporate world has taken on that thing of purpose. And unfortunately, it's a pretty void, disconnected sense of purpose that lacks the energy of real purpose in most cases, not in every case, because, the purpose of almost every corporation is make money. And so they try to dress that up with whatever. We're going to increase wealth in families and we're going to make them, more effective. And that could be true. And that sometimes is true, but you want to start with a purpose that's meaningful, that's going to motivate people. Like, what are we doing that's going to, like have people, it's going to bring fire on people and then bring them into the fold, right? So a lot of leadership, there's really, I think the number one problem other than lack of real project fire and that's purpose, but some companies have that and some projects have that, is that we don't really trust the humans that show up to help us in that project. And the lack of trust manifests in all sorts of ways. And the truth is that when you bring humans with fire of a project and real trust of I see the potential in you and I see what you can do and I see your greatness. And you see more than they see on themselves. Human beings just really react to that. And because the truth is that our potential as humans, every single human, is so enormous and so much bigger than where we are today that not trusting any human that they can't do certain things is kind of ridiculous, actually. And of course, we all, that's not to say, to be naive and to not understand where people are in their journey and their process and their capabilities. And of course, there's technical training. There's certain jobs that you require technical expertise. So all of that, of course, we have to live in reality and facts, but it's really that ability to just connect people to the purpose and to see their potential and to empower that and to really be a partner with them. Like, my job in Sangha with my team is to help them in that journey of being the highest expression of the human being that they can be. And sometimes that may mean and will mean that their journey inside of Sangha or inside of Global X or inside of whatever project is like, okay, now you should go off and do this other thing. And it's going to be a massive loss for the business, but it's the right thing for you because you're just so powerful at this point. You can do so many things. And so, yes, you should now run for senator or you should now do whatever this other thing that you're being called into. So, yeah, spot on. Leadership in humans, empowerment and capacity is just a beautiful field.
What does balance mean to you?
Yeah, again, I sort of resist that word because balance goes back to that splitting of our lives into the professional and personal and family and spiritual. And I prefer to think about maybe integration. That's a better word than balance.
You almost start from a balance perspective as opposed to being imbalanced and trying to get there.
Yes, okay, that's a different question. If most people are out of balance. And so how do you go from out of balance to living in essentially the opposite of balance, which is in fire, right? In like total, like I'm like in fire, but in fire, there is power to the word balance because when you are in fire, you're also in balance. You're also in a place, there's a quote from the Tao Te Ching that says something like the master stays at the center of the circle, yet everything gets done. And that's very true. That sort of describes what I was talking about of all of nature supporting you. More of a journey. If you're starting out of balance, how do you go into being in that place of being at the center of the circle and everything gets done? And what I needed to do when I started was to slow down and to reprioritize, to literally give up certain things and just create a little bit of space, even if it's just that 10 minutes of journaling in the morning, asking that question. Super powerful. If a lot of us are in back-to-back Zooms these days, spend 5 minutes after a Zoom call before you get into the next one, going for a little walk, taking a few breaths. Even if I finish my call on the hour and my next call is starting right after, I literally do a thing which I call the 1 minute meditation, which is, there's a breath technique, for example. I'll just explain the one I do. There's many ways to do these, but so pranayama, it's a way of calming the nervous system and really resetting from a fight-flight response to really being in a calm, present, balanced state. And so what I do is I breathe in for 4 units. It could be 4 seconds, but just a count of 4. Hold the breath for 7 and exhale for 9. 4, 7, 8. Exhale for 8. So in for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. So if that's a second, that's 19 seconds. If you do that 3 times, that's a minute. So I do that between Zoom calls. If I'm going back to back, I just stay on my chair, do 3 times that breath, and I'm ready for the next call. That's kind of like a reset. So whatever your technique, it could be like a little walk. It could be, a few breaths. It could be, what's really powerful that's, accessible for a lot of people is nature. And so if you can go, ideally every day for like a 30-minute walk in nature, alone, in silence, without headphones, without music, without podcast, that's really powerful to connect us and relax our system. So I think just if we start from imbalance, bringing small moments of silence to our lives, just to give us a little bit of space for our true nature to start to, because the true nature comes through. We just need to give it a little bit of space. So yes, creating a little bit of spaciousness, which, what I just described doesn't take a lot of time, right? 10 minutes journaling in the morning, a minute between Zoom calls, and maybe a 30-minute walk in nature. That's less than an hour. And, most of us can fit that if we reprioritize, not watching that Netflix show or whatever.
In my experience, daily life tends to force people to zoom in to what's right in front of them. And they get caught up in this task and the next task and the next task. And oftentimes I find it helpful to, like you said, take a pause and zoom out and look at your world around you from a broader perspective, and then ask those questions of, why am I doing this? Why am I here? How should I think about this? And it kind of, those bigger questions need to be asked intentionally, because if you just let yourself go, you may not actually take the time to zoom out and view it from that perspective.
I think that's exactly right. One of the things that does exist in our culture is New Year resolutions. And within that, some people do like a full year sort of review, like a little bit of a pause, and be like, how was the last year? Where am I? What do I want for the next year? And so taking natural breaks, like, the new year, to do a little bit of a reflective exercise. And you can go online and find a million types of kind of like year review type exercises. Those are really powerful. One of the things when I started this journey that I did this exercise called the Lifeline Review, or the Lifeline exercise. I did it a second time, and the power of that exercise and kind of the learnings that I received for that were so powerful. And I wonder how it is amazing how very, very little time I had spent in my time actually reviewing my life. And, we've worked really hard to build this life. We've gone through a lot of suffering and effort and sweat and tears. And we've this is the only data point that you have, or series of thousands of data points that is custom made for Alex or Bruno. Like, this is really kind of, and if you think about it from our perspective, like our field, I don't think you'll find any successful active asset manager that wouldn't obsess about how they did in the past and the investment decisions that they made and the mistakes and the failures. That's a prerequisite to be a good investor. Yet we don't seem to be, I speak for myself, wasn't really spending very much time at all doing that with my own life. And what did I do and how did I do it? And why am I where I'm here? And what are the decisions I made? And I think that exercise is incredibly powerful.
How do you think about intelligence versus wisdom?
There's a quote from Einstein that I'm not going to remember exactly how it goes, but it's something like intuition is a sacred gift, and our cognitive thinking, our intelligence, is the servant. Yet we have created a culture that honors the servant and has forgotten about the gift. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that quote. And it sort of speaks to, I think, the right place of both intuition and cognitive thinking, in that they're both tools, right? So these are tools. And for me, the way I think of wisdom is our ability to discriminate truth, which is much harder than we think. Let's take somebody that humanity considers, and I consider to be one of the great wise people across human history, which is Seneca. Seneca said, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know anything at all, or I know nothing. That was not false humility. Seneca is, in fact, too wise. There's a very profound truth. And what Seneca is speaking to, which mirrors my experience, is when I was younger, I kind of thought I knew everything in a sense. I know how the system works. I know how to navigate the system. I'm very successful. I got this. I got this game. And now I actually think I really barely understand anything. But this comes not from a place of despair. This comes from a place of, the great masters also talk about, Jesus talked about, be like a child. Be like a child doesn't mean, the children don't have wisdom. But what children do have is just wonder. They're just, everything around them is wondrous and an adventure and an opportunity. That's where I am now. I am in a place where I just look around me and I observe the reality of what's unfolding. And I am in constant awe of what in the world is going on and how does it work like this and what are these forces that are happening. And that's what I think Jesus meant. Be like a child means that, along with his other command, which is metanoia, change your consciousness. When you do that and change your consciousness from this know-it-all person to like, oh my God, like you really start realizing the deeper truth in front of our eyes, you develop the wonder of a child. And so what is wisdom? I do think is kind of our ability to discriminate truth. But as I said, I think it's really hard to do. So wisdom is a very, very scarce commodity, I think, in the world.
I think it also has a lot to do with your frame of reference, meaning if you look at the world from close up, you may feel like you've got it all figured out. And my experience is as you get older, you realize how vast the universe is. And the more you zoom out, you realize how small you are and how little you actually know. And maybe part of wisdom is that realization that the universe of knowledge is so broad and so complex that you can't possibly ever know as much as you thought you did.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to say that. I love that analogy. One analogy that your example brings up along those lines is, imagine you're a cell in the human body and, in the skin, and you kind of become a master. You figure it out. It's like, I know exactly how the game works. I know how to do it. When I get cut, I know how to like navigate to generate, and send the messages so that new cells are developed. And so I'm a master. I got these figured out, but the cell has no consciousness. It's like, well, I'm really part of this like enormous system that's a human body, and a human body is part of this bigger system. And so I think that is true. I think the more understanding you have, the more perspective you have, the more you zoom out, the more you realize, wow, this is pretty wondrous.
Yeah, and then that also leads to that fire that you described, which is, the universe is so vast. There's so much more to learn. There's so much more ability to grow, and that is what can drive you. And so that's a very different way of thinking about it than here's a specific finish line that I got to get to, and then let me move the finish line. This is more about growth, which is, I think, where we started our conversation.
That's partially true, but that's more of an intellectual process of getting to the potential of wonder. Fire comes from the heart. Fire is when your heart really opens, and it opens to love, and you become connected to something bigger than yourself. That is the fire. The fire is doesn't come, again, going back to Einstein's kind of analogy. The mind is the servant. The mind is here. It's a powerful tool. It's a very important tool to help us discriminate. But the real source of connection and truth, frankly, that when Einstein talks about intuition, what does intuition even mean? What is he referring to? The substance behind that really comes through the heart, and that's where fire and that life force, to use kind of the Taoist term, or the Vedic kind of, that's where the fire comes from.
And tying this back to leadership, when you're working with team members who may have limitations in certain areas, how do you approach their development?
The first thing is love and compassion and understanding, because as you go through the journey, you realize that what I have been taking credit for all along, maybe it's not entirely my doing. And maybe there's something bigger going on. And that's my belief today. Again, as I connect, or one connects through those forces of nature and gets supported by everything, and these synchronicities happen, it's like, well, I'm not the one manufacturing this crazy coincidence of this person showing up, or this, incredible thing that just came into my life just when I needed it. And so, that others are at different places in their journey, it's just part of the nature. And that was me at a different place. And so the first place is just full compassion and understanding of where they may be. And also the other side of it, full understanding of the potential of that human, of what they can actually be. And you see that with the great masters. Like, the great masters meet these people, like Jesus, the 12 people that he chose, it's the fisherman and the tax collector and the prostitute, and, and it's just he sees the beauty and the potential. And just those two things are already an enormous source of transformation. And the other thing that gets missed in leadership, because it's not observable with our eyes, but it is a felt sense, is our own transformation. So the first thing a leader needs to do is to transform him or herself and grow. And when that happens, and the leader is operating from a higher level of consciousness, that vibration and that love and that compassion is felt. It's you walk into the room and people feel it. And the fact that their potential, this is not an act, this is not a performance, it, they feel it. And so people respond to that, It's so what's really interesting about the deepest level of leadership is that a lot of it happens really in silent ways, but there's a lot of work behind that. There's a lot of work behind our ability to show up in a room or a meeting or a presentation or a conference when you're just coming up and vibrating at a different level. And, and then the rest is just tactical, and we can all figure that out, right? Like, they may need, some investment and some professional development in certain areas, or maybe a coach, or maybe, so those are more tactical things that when you're showing up with the combination of love and compassion and potential, then the rest is tactical. We can all kind of solve the problem.
You just mentioned a coach. We know most elite athletes have coaches throughout their careers. What are your thoughts on having a coach?
It's interesting you mentioned lead athletes, because when I was going through that journey of, trying to become the best leader I could, and I had this sense of like, I should maybe hire a coach to work with. And there was real resistance in my system. This is also a long time ago. So we're talking about maybe, 15 years ago or something. And, I grew up in a household where if you work with a psychologist, like there's something wrong with you. And there was a huge stigma around that. And of course, like a coach just felt like another version of that. And so, hiring a coach essentially is admitting a weakness within. And I was at this event, and I was meeting this friend of mine, and I sensed he sort of knew, and he had maybe worked with coaches. And I asked him, I'm thinking of hiring a coach. Like, what are your thoughts? And to the wisdom point, this was a person that I thought held some wisdom. And he said, he knew I was from Spain. He said, Bruno, do you like tennis? I said, I love tennis. Rafa Nadal and now Carlos Alcaraz are like huge heroes of mine. And he said, okay, what would you think so this was 15 years ago, what would you think if Rafa Nadal did not have a coach? And it was so clear. Like, it's like, wow, that would be a massive mistake. And he said, well, what makes you so special? Right? Oh, because the other thing he said, do you think Rafa Nadal would be one of the 20 best tennis minds in the world? And I'm like, okay. I mean, he's not only he's an incredible tennis player, but he's an incredible mind and problem solver. And so, yeah, he very well may be one of the best 20 tennis minds in the world. So the fact that, somebody that can problem solve, that is at that level of like literally, the 0.0001% in the world, still, it's obvious that person needs a coach, that's helpful. Made it very clear, like, okay, yes, I can, and it's not so much that I need a coach, but if I want to be the best leader I can possibly be, yes, let me enlist somebody that can be a bit of a mirror and bring him into the process, or her, to just support me in that journey. And so, it's not for every context and every moment, but as a general principle, having a team of people that support you, and that type of, coaches these days have really great training, and it's a very helpful process. And of course, it's like everything in life. There's people that are better and worse at their craft, but if you can find a really great coach, it can be life-changing. And it was in my case.
Well, Bruno, this has been inspiring. I've enjoyed our conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alex. Pleasure being with you.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit our website at insightfulinvestor.org to access past shows and learn more about our podcast. If you have questions, feel free to email us at info@insightfulinvestor.org. And if you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe to this podcast to ensure you don't miss future episodes. And don't forget to forward today's conversation to others you think would enjoy listening. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Evoke advisors, their affiliates, or companies featured. Due to industry regulations, participants on this podcast are instructed not to make specific trade recommendations, nor reference past or potential profits. And listeners are reminded that securities trading, commodity trading, and alternative investments are complex and carry a risk of substantial losses. As such, they are not suitable for all investors. Listeners should be aware that guests featured on The Insightful Investor may have current or past associations with Evoke advisors or the host, including as an investment manager of a private fund opportunity by Evoke, or access through an affiliated Evoke fund, or as a client. Participation as a guest on the podcast should not be perceived as an endorsement or testimonial with respect to Evoke advisors, the podcast host, or their services. Similarly, the inclusion of a guest on the podcast does not imply that Evoke advisors or the host endorses the guest or any company with which they may be affiliated or employed. Evoke has neither paid nor received compensation from guests for their participation.